we should be out on Twitter and YouTube right now. Yep. Okay. So Sean Kui should join us here in a second. I think he went to the wrong spot, which is
it happens.
Yep. I don't know.
It's possible that he went to the participant
I think that's what he did.
Rather than following Charlotte's email to go to the this connection.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe somebody will tell him.
I emailed him.
Hopefully he's looking at email.
So, well, he literally just emailed me, so he should be
joining us soon.
Yes. I emailed him. Okay. So while we're waiting for Chankwi, why don't we go ahead and do brief introductions of everybody? That way, people who are watching know who we are. So I'll go ahead and start. My name is Richard Roth. I'm the president of the Agronomy Graduate Student Organization at Purdue University. I'm a doctoral candidate studying soil and water conservation and management. And today I'll be moderating the panel that we have. So the first person, let's go with Dr. Vine, just a brief introduction.
Hello, I'm Tony Vine, and I'm proud to be an agronomy professor and also a Henry Wallace Corteva Chair, and I am perhaps most proud of having mentored many graduate students, including going through, and that includes going through the sweat of writing publications. And so it'll be a great opportunity to dialogue with colleagues and to respond to questions you might have today.
Hey, I'm Linda Lee. I'm a professor in agronomy as well. My area is environmental chemistry, and I'm also program head for the Ecological Sciences and Engineering Interdisciplinary Graduate Program. And like Dr. Vine, I also take a lot of pride and joy in mentoring students, and specifically graduate students, because each one of them are individuals. I always say, like stripes on a zebra. Every zebra has unique stripes, and so we as faculty are challenged in that mentoring to do so. And publishing is one of the challenges. So,
hi everyone. My name is Diane Wong. I'm an assistant professor here in Purdue Agronomy. I just started here in January, so I'm pretty much brand new. Formally trained in plant breeding and genetics, and I postdoced in ecophysiological process-based modeling. And so my program here tries to bridge those two disciplines. And I've just started up here with my first student and calling in from the Purdue Controlled Environment Phenotyping Facility. My student Rachel is just behind those doors. We're about to start some measurements right after this panel. So happy to be here.
Good morning. My name is Chankui Zhang, and I am an assistant professor in agronomy department. And in 2 weeks, I will be promoted to associate professor, so that is good. My area of expertise is in plant physiology and biotechnology. In the recent 2 years, my program could publish 7 to 8 papers per year. I think given the size of my program, I think it is not bad. Thank you for inviting me to this panel. I look forward to sharing some of my experiences on publishing papers.
Thank you. So just for the audience members viewing, so as you have questions, please type them in the chat, and we will get to those as we can. So let's go ahead and get started with just a question on so basically, how do you guys choose what journals you go to for publication? So you're all in different areas, and I assume that everybody has their own way of doing it. But for specifically for like students who are going through this for maybe the first time, what do you try to make sure you look for when you choose a journal that you publish in? And let's go ahead and start with Tony on this one.
Well, thank you. The choice of a journal is one of the more difficult choices that need to be made, and it is sometimes even more difficult and challenging than writing the paper itself. And it's been my experience that we consider impact of the journal, but that we also very strongly consider the audience of that journal and whether it will be read by peers. And so often we consider factors like, in your list of references, what's a common journal that comes up? And so there we might aim then for a journal that has routinely come and approached that a similar topic from different angles, perhaps. But traditionally, we have gone in the direction of aiming for the highest impact journal that is available, for which our science is qualified. And then we have gone also with this emphasis on trying to reach an audience which will benefit from it and which may consider citations in the future.
Okay. Does anybody else have anything to add?
Yeah, I just want to add one thing. So the speed of publication is another consideration. I think especially for graduate students, right? Like for some of the journals, it takes 2 years before they get your paper published, but you don't have so much time. So you can actually, yes, check out the speed of, accepting or processing your papers for each of the journals, for most of the journals.
Okay.
I just want to jump in here. So one of the my best papers, I thought, would have qualified for Nature Plants. So it's got an impact factor above 11. The nice thing about submitting something to Nature Plants is that you get a response back from the editor within 2 weeks. And so you can take that paper back. In my case, it was rejected, but it came back with the suggestion of, well, why don't you publish this in Nature Scientific Report? It did. Much lower impact journal, but it was a fast decision. We felt disappointed, but we carried on with the next year, and we were successful that time around. So rejection happens, but I wouldn't let it get to you.
And I would just add, if you're a graduate student and this is your first paper, you can also see what other previous graduate students have published in your lab group. So I remember the first paper that I was trying to figure out, what is the appropriate journal. I remember looking at some of the articles that were published in some of the more senior graduate students, and that was very helpful, I thought.
So to go with that, have any of you ever been approached by the predatory journals that send you the emails that ask for papers, and how do you know whether they're legit or not?
Every day.
Yeah, I ignore them all.
Yep, ditto.
So just if it's unsolicited, just ignore it then.
Definitely.
Yep.
I'm not desperate to find places to publish, so I don't need to lower my standards or succumb to entertaining such emails.
About the only thing that's sometimes enticing is their low manuscript fees compared to the other journals that we often publish in. But we will find the money somehow to publish where we get the best exposure.
Yeah, actually, that's a good point that we didn't bring up in selecting a journal. I mean, most of the journals I publish in, I would say 99% of them, there are no fees, so I don't have to think about it. But if there is a fee, like, for example, if I think back to the audience comment that Dr. Vine made, if I think that's very appropriate for an agronomy journal or an ASA journal, because that's the audience that needs to hear this, even if they're not the audience that typically would search out this material, they need to hear it, they're missing it. Maybe I'd say, okay, that's going to cost us some money, less if I'm a member, and I am, and we'll go for it. So, but I think that if you had everything's equal, you're going to go with the journal that doesn't cost as much or is free.
Just to add to that, we publish all of our articles open access, and they can come with some quite significant fees. But there are journals that give an option for free open access publication if your institution is a member. So, for instance, Journal of Experimental Botany, if your institution is a member, then you can publish open access for free, which is really, really nice.
Okay. So you talked about maximizing your impact. So I guess what metrics are you using to measure the impact of journals? Like, I know that obviously you can just look up the impact factor, but is there any other metrics that you use other than impact factor?
I'm probably more cognizant of citations than I am of impact factor, which is one of the reasons for targeting a manuscript to something which represents an audience that's likely to take advantage of that. So citation number is something that factors in, and of course it's hard to estimate when you submit something what its citation value will be, but it is sometimes helped by having a very thoughtfully worded title, and it is often helped by having a clear description of highlights and a very carefully worded abstract.
So I think in addition to impact factor, whether that is a well-recognized journal in your field is very important. Trust me, like a lot of journals have a much higher impact factor than crop science, but they are not as good as crop science.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think to go along with that comment, if a journal, every journal has articles that get through that we read and say, how did this ever get published? But some journals have many more of those, and I don't really want to be a part of those journals.
Okay. Okay. So moving on. So what do you guys do in order to maximize the likelihood that your paper is accepted? Obviously, I know write a good paper, right? But is there anything else that you can do besides just have written a good paper to maximize your possibility of being accepted? And Dr. Zhang, let's start with you. And
Okay.
if you have an opinion on it.
Oh, yes, I do. So I think you have to know where you want to publish for the type of work you are doing, right? So once you figure that out, you can actually read some papers from those journals and get to know what is normally required by that journal. For example, I'm not familiar with crop science, but from what I heard of crop science is you have to have 2 years field data as a replicate before you can publish your work. So if you want to publish your work in crop science, you have to do that, right? But in my area, just the 1 year of replicate in greenhouse is good enough. But, that's in like plant physiology or plant cell reports, journals like that. So you have to read papers from those journals that you want to target. That's my comment.
Yeah, and I would say that, you typically have co-authors, and so it's very valuable to be bouncing your paper back and forth with your co-author. That also helps move it along faster rather than it just sitting on someone's desk who thinks they have to spend, days and days if they can just do some initial comments. So that speeds it up and also helps to craft it better. And then having someone with fresh eyes review it after you think it's ready to be submitted. And sometimes even better than that, and it's very hard to do, is for after you think, okay, it's ready to submit, put it in a folder and put it off to the side and come back to it in a month, because you will be shocked to find out when you come back to it in a month, oh my gosh, that's not even clear, or I didn't say that I didn't articulate that in a very streamlined way, or there's just so many things that when they come back from review and you get review comments, you're like, oh yeah, why didn't I see that? Why? Because when your head's in it, back and forth on a daily basis, you just don't see the obvious. But most of the time we find it very hard to not just get it submitted, but if you have the tenacity, put it off and wait a few weeks and revisit.
Okay. Great. So you just talked about having co-authors. So I guess this raises an interesting question of how do you handle the issue of authorship and things like author order, and obviously there's a point of view from the professor side of things, but also if you could think about maybe from like the student view. How should a student handle things? So maybe like, I've heard some students say that they always put every committee member on a paper versus others say that they put, only one who maybe helped them focus on that project. So if you could maybe answer the question from both the professor side of things and then also recommendations for students. And Dr. Wong, let's start with you.
Sure. So a couple thoughts on that. I would say in terms of who to include on your author list, you can try approaches like thinking about if you remove that person, would the work have changed? Like, did that person significantly alter or kind of guide the direction of that work? And if they did, then I think that they should be considered a co-author. And if you think that if you remove that person, then the story wouldn't change at all, or the work, the results, or the discussion wouldn't have changed, then probably they can just be acknowledged. In terms of order, that is always kind of tricky, and it also it really differs a lot across disciplines. I've done a lot of interdisciplinary work, and there's certainly vastly different expectations. And to be able to, I mean, that's the fun part about interdisciplinary work. You get to kind of learn each other's language and your assumptions. But when they don't fit, they can be problematic afterwards. So I think it's really important to be very clear up front. So for example, in fields like genome biology, where you have author lists of 20 to 30, it's first and last and kind of are the most important, and it kind of is nested. In fields where author lists are typically 2 to 5 people, then these tend to be unidirectional. And so if you have a paper that mixes those disciplines, yeah, it gets a little bit tricky, but just to be transparent upfront, I think is the best way to go, and to have that discussion earlier, the earlier the better.
Yeah, I support everything that Dr. Wang said. I also want to say that, I mean, my mantra, and I really feel like it should be all faculty, is that if whoever does the first reasonable draft, which is usually the person who did the bulk of the experimental work, they should be first author. And I've seen too often, unfortunately, where students are not allowed to be first author on their work because a faculty person cares more about themselves being first author, or part of the tenure process, I need to be first author. And I fight those cases all the time when someone says, well, they haven't been first author. I'm sorry, they're corresponding author. This is their student. They're doing what they should be doing as a faculty member. As a student, you get stuck in a bad place, and you need to feel free to go talk to, first, you can address it with your research advisor. If you're not comfortable on how to do that, you need to talk to another faculty member who will hold it in confidence and guide you on how to address that and to how to assess that. So I think that's, really important, that students should be first authors on the work that they, even if they didn't come up with the original idea, a lot of times, we as faculty have some initial ideas, and then, we help you take it and run. It doesn't matter. I think that the students should be first author if they've done the bulk of the work and did a first reasonable draft. So just saying that for the students out there, so that you can know that you have a right to bring this up if you feel like you're getting shortchanged. And I should also add that sometimes there's co-authors, they're not on your committee, because a committee just says they're committed to providing you input. There's a lot of faculty out there that might provide a whole lot more input than anybody on your committee did for, whatever reason. That's not a judgment call. But your research advisor might not realize how much, if my student went to Dr. Vine all the time and got a lot of input, your faculty advisor might not know that. So that's your job to say, Dr. Vine helped me a lot on this. I want him to be co-author if he's willing to. Then he has the right to review it and decide if he wants to be co-author. That's another thing. You need to give co-authors invitation. You need to ask them. I get asked a lot of times, I say, wait a minute, I helped you just like any other student. It wasn't that much help. I don't want to be a co-author. You may acknowledge me. And I'm not saying I think your paper's terrible. I don't think I meet criteria for true authorship. And there's plenty of things out there to read on that criteria. So that's just, maybe more than you wanted, but I'm throwing it out there.
I agree with all of those statements, but I will say, since we're talking to graduate students today, our role first and foremost as professors is to promote graduate students as the first author. But I would also say this, that that doesn't necessarily mean that just because you're part of a graduate student group that you will automatically be included on every paper from that professor's lab group. I mean, because I don't think that necessarily qualifies you just because you are assisting at the bench or in the field or in the phenotyping center. So, so there is an expectation always of an intellectual contribution, and I think this what Dr. Wang mentioned about, would a name removal have affected the outcome of the paper, I think is a good criteria to use.
You just brought up something, Tony, that can be a little tricky. Sometimes two graduate students are working together on a project, and it might seem, I think that can be the most difficult time to decide, well, who should be first author versus second author? And we just have to have open conversations about that. And typically, I try to say, okay, well, why don't we let so-and-so be first author this time? And then when we do this next publication, we'll invert it. Somehow you have to, and there are a few journals that allow you to denote equal authorship for the first two authors, but not a lot of them do that, and that gets complicated. It's better just to have the conversation. So
one of the things besides just the actual names is basically deciding who is going to be the corresponding author. And I'm perhaps a little bit too focused on wanting to be the final decider as to whether the initial manuscript submission or whether the revision letter and the revised manuscript is up to what I view as being, an acceptable level. And so, so far in our department, it's not common to have graduate students also be the corresponding author, but it is a very good experience for them to do so, particularly at the PhD level.
Yeah, I agree with Dr. Vine. I think a lot of times I'm corresponding author because there's a workload with that, and not necessarily a workload you want your students to have to bear, but also because in general, we have a more stable email contact. We're pretty much same email for years unless we hop around a lot. So, I typically place myself at the end, even if I had equal, contribution as a student, and I'm corresponding author. That's just my habit. Students first author, I'm last author, everybody in between, order them how you want, But like Dr. Wang said, it's very discipline specific. Sometimes, it's alphabetical in the mathematical field. So the first author that did all the work might never be the first author because they just do alphabetical, so.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, that's great. So I have some follow-up questions off of that. But first we have a question that came in through the chat. And it's actually from an individual who is in Brazil. And so they're asking about publishing in a home language instead of publishing internationally. So I don't know, if you guys have experience with that, but
I would just say it depends on the audience you're trying to impact. If your work is most relevant in the country where you're doing it and happens to be your native language, then that would be okay, would be fine, right? And it's not going to have the same impact as publishing in an international journal, but maybe the audience you want to reach, that's the audience that needs to hear this the most. So, and maybe you can be creative and find ways of publishing a piece of that a different way in an international journal so that you might hit both targets.
So I like to add one more thing. Maybe if you publish your paper in your own language, but for the abstract part, you can still write in English and your home language. So that may increase citation a little bit. Actually, before I came to this country, I published 7 or 8 papers in Chinese. It has been so many years. In total, they were only cited for 5 times. Yeah, if you want to increase citation and exposure of your work, I still think publishing in English is a better choice.
Okay. So to get back to what we were discussing as far as the authorship and things like that, and you hit on it a little bit, but so specifically for, say, like a PhD student who is looking for like a faculty job, so do all publications hold the same weight? Meaning, if you're first author versus last author versus anywhere in between, how are those viewed, maybe by your peers?
Well, I think that for students going out for their first time jobs, they need to have some first author papers, but that combined with other papers where they're not first author shows that they're also part of a team. So both are good. But this is also why it's so important for you to be allowed to be first author on the work that you led, because you need that. That's important. And it depends on what type of job you're getting. If you're going to industry, it might not matter near as much as if you're trying to get an academic job. Although even if you're trying to do a postdoc, in spite of what your career goal is, I think postdoc advisors are going to say, well, can they even write a paper on their own, or did this, if they weren't first author, I'm going to be on anything. I'm thinking, okay, they're not really good they might be good in the lab, but they're not good at writing things up. And oftentimes that's such an impediment, for faculty because of our time, and now you're telling me I'm going to have to write the first draft of your data. That makes me concerned. So first author there would also be important to me.
So I like to add a little bit about my own experiences. So like if I admit a postdoc, of course I want the postdoc to have some first author papers. And in addition to that, actually I also see whether the postdoc has some middle author papers, because that is a good indication on the personality of this person. Oh, I should not say that is, but that may be a good indication. For the type of work we are doing in my lab, collaboration is very important. If a person only wants to be first author and does not want to collaborate with other people, that's not a good sign.
Okay. Great. Okay. So I think this is actually a question that I have, but I think it will help other people as well. So as a student, what is all of your opinions on students accepting review requests from journals, and should they do it? and anybody who has an opinion can jump off and start.
Well, I hate doing reviews, period, because they're incredibly time consuming, although they can be cited a lot if they're reasonably good. They don't even have to be great, reasonably good. So I tell a student, I don't know how often any of my students have been asked directly themselves, but if I get asked to do something that I think that's a review request that I might, that aligns with somebody's research in the group, I might say, is this something you're interested in? And I'll be honest, I don't like reviews. They take a long time. They need to be systematic. And if they say, yeah, I really want to do this, and it will support their research direction and knowledge base and their proposal, then I support it. And then as a faculty member, you have to know it's going to take them a long time. They're going to underestimate the time it takes to do a good review. But there's my 2 cents.
Can I just ask a clarifying question? Are we talking about writing reviews or reviewing peer-reviewed manuscripts from journals?
Being a peer reviewer.
Oh, I answered the wrong question.
Sorry. Maybe I wasn't clear. So if a journal comes to your students and asks them to be a peer reviewer for an article,
I would discuss. I would encourage them. They don't know how long that takes. It's good for them to do a few. I usually wait until it's more like if it's a PhD student, more like after the first 2 years. Initially, I might have them, say, well, okay, so I reviewed this and have them share, do a share review. You can ask a editor, I'm going to have my graduate student share this review with me. So I'm responsible, but I can help them in the review process to understand it. So, yeah.
I promote the idea of shared reviews, as Dr. Lee was just talking about. So basically, there is a real learning experience that goes along with doing a peer review. But I am reluctant to have even PhD students accept more than a few during their 3 or 4 year tenure because of the time commitment that's involved. At the same time, I recognize that we live in a time when journals are proliferating and the requests to do reviews are proliferating. And frankly, I think that is exploding to the detriment of good science. And so we're kind of caught a little bit. And so it's quite natural for journals to be not necessarily going with the person that has the highest Google Scholar score, but to go progressively to less and less cited authors as peer reviewers, and it's a numbers game. And so that's part of what happens. So it is a great learning experience. First, best done in association with where you're allowed to share a manuscript with your lab team, and you let the editor-in-chief know that that's what's doing and that's approved. That's a great way to learn. But the full responsibility of doing these reviews is something that I would defer until later in the PhD program, as was mentioned earlier.
I normally ask my students to help me review like 3 to 4 papers every year. But of course, I take the responsibility. And I think, but you have to pay attention to the type of papers they can help you review. The papers must be in their area, in what they are doing, so they know the literature, right? And the reason I'm promoting this is because I think reviewing papers by students can train their critical thinking ability. Because normally, like for published papers, they were already reviewed. But for these submitted papers, quite often students can find their problems. So I think this is a good training process. I promote it.
Great. Yeah, I've done one before, but I've only been asked one time to do it. So I just was trying to get your opinions on that for other students. So can we talk about rejection now? So it happens to everybody. I've been involved with a few papers that have been rejected. But I guess my question is that when you are rejected, I guess what's the next steps that you take? I mean, obviously you believe in the work that you did, right? Or else you wouldn't have tried to publish it. So I guess what do you do next after your first attempt gets rejected? And I don't know who has an opinion on this.
Yeah, I can see something. I guess because I have a lot of papers that were rejected in the beginning. So I like to tell you a story, very, very brief story. So in 2009, I submitted paper to PNAS. Then 1 month later, it was rejected. And I was very frustrated, I thought that's a good paper. And I went to my advisor's office. You know what happened? He stood up from his chair and he shook my hand and said, "Congratulations, Tangui, you will have paper published in PNAS." I said, "Okay, it is rejected." My boss said, "Look at the reviews. Okay, it will be accepted." The reason I'm telling you this story is each journal has its own style. Like for plant physiology and PNAS, this kind of like journal, they rarely accept your paper in the first round. It is always rejection. Like plant physiology, this journal in my area, right? 90% of the published papers got rejected in the first round. Okay? So basically, if your paper is rejected, don't worry about it. Just study the comments and see if they can be addressed. If they can be addressed, don't worry about it. You still can resubmit your paper. It has a very good chance to be final accepted.
Yeah, and then a lot of journals will say major revision, and that major is could be anything from hardly anything to major. Because if it's the other option is minor revision, which usually just means can you put a different figure in or can you improve, but major revision still might be not very much. So you just take the comments and improve it and resubmit. No matter what the outcome of the journal is, whether it's major revision or outright rejection. So some journals, if they reject, they mean reject. Don't submit this again. But you should read the comments, and it's typically, even myself, the first thing is I'm really defensive. Then in your first, but then if you look more carefully, you realize that when someone has a question that you want to say, well, they clearly didn't read it or they clearly didn't understand. Oh, that means I didn't clearly articulate how we did the work, or how we didn't clearly articulate the interpretation of our data. So again, this has to do with, getting fresh eyes on your manuscript before you submitted it, or putting it off to the side for a few weeks. But sometimes there's a couple other reasons. Sometimes a journal will decide your work was not appropriate for that journal. And that might just be like, I remember one time when I had 3 reviews. One was accept as is, one was accept minor revision, one was major revision. And the editor made a decision that the work wasn't appropriate for that journal. But interesting enough, less than 1 year later, what the concept that was in my paper was now the front cover of that journal. They weren't on the cutting edge, The other reason can be political. So sometimes if you I've had this happen recently. I had a paper rejected, and it made no sense because I knew it was going to be a highly cited paper, highly desired by the audience. And then I thought, there is something very political going on here. So I addressed it with the editor, and then resubmitted as a whole new manuscript just 1 week later, and it got accepted. So it has to do with, certain reviewers might not want your work out there before their work's out there, and that's very sad. And it doesn't happen most of the time, but it is a reality. And so usually your advisor can help you sort through those things. And you just have to not be afraid to respectfully approach the editor about such things.
Every good scientist has rejected papers in their background. And sometimes the rejection can be accompanied by an opportunity to resubmit. And sometimes that's clear in the rejection letter. Sometimes it's not clear in the rejection letter, but you can still go to the editor-in-chief. But each rejection that I've had have been accompanied by enough review comments that the outcome of the next manuscript was more successful or more likely to succeed. What is sad, I find, is that you take a rejection as a ultimate, and you decide to not publish that science. I mean, that hurts the whole scientific community because of the investment that's made in that research. So a more mature way of looking at a rejection is basically, what can I learn from the review comments? Maybe I need to go to a different journal, or maybe I need to repackage this research. And so there are instances where I've had a PhD student who, we initially thought 4 chapters. These are 4 great papers. We were faced with rejections, and we decided to repackage it with more focus on 2 papers. And those are great papers, right? So, I mean, it's part of it is in focusing on a theme that resonates with the reviewers, and that sounds more novel than a simple regurgitation of, well, I tweaked this and tweaked that, and these were my results. So, yeah. So take it as a building opportunity, and it happens to everyone.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, when your paper is rejected, you should not take it personal. And I know having a paper being rejected is a depressing thing. But when you think about it as a scientist, your whole life, 90% of your life is in this rejection process, right? When you are a student, when you do experiments, right? Quite often you fail, then you succeed. That's a rejection process. And when you submit a paper, rejection, then accept it. But later on, when you become a faculty member, you write grant proposals. You will have many, many more rejections before you have one accepted. So this is a training process, being a scientist. to handle well on this rejection process, I believe. Don't let the rejection, just knock down you.
Yeah, I second that. Rejection is certainly just part of the process, and yeah, if you just don't take it personally, I guess there's several flavors of rejection, which have been kind of alluded to by the other three panelists. But there's the desk rejection, so that's when you first submit to a journal and it doesn't pass the gatekeeper for whatever reason. Perhaps your manuscript was not within the scope of the journal, or maybe it just didn't have that high enough impact, like if you submitted to Nature or something. I mean, you'll hear back within 12 hours probably. And those are nice because they're fast. And then there's the reject with encouragement to resubmit, which if you address the comments thoroughly, you have a very high probability of getting it accepted eventually. And then there's the outright rejection. But you can still learn from every opportunity, because if the referees have provided you with comments, then there's something to go on, right? There's the next step. So the next step could either be go to another journal or to continue on with that one. And it's really just part of the process. And I think with every round of review that you do, or every round of revisions, you are improving the work. And so in the end, the product is going to be much better because you've had that many more eyes on it.
Yeah.
And
So
Richard, I don't know if this is an appropriate place to insert this, but there was kind of a funny thing when I was in graduate school called the minimum publishable volume, MPV. So I know, so there's a fine balance between trying to get as many, manuscripts or publications as you can, versus having too much in a publication where people only take away half of it and the other half never really gets noticed because you put too much in it. So there's a fine balance. So I don't support the MPV, but as Dr. Vine said, it's just getting a little out of hand, and there's a lot of MPVs out there. But then so it's all about packaging. And so sometimes the review process also helps you better understand how to package, like was exemplified. So.
okay. Yeah, so we actually have a question that's actually from Adabacola Dada in our department. And it's, what would you advise students to do to build the capacity to write acceptable papers? I think what she's getting at is, what advice do you give to students to improve their writing?
Well, first of all, you're reading articles all the time. So sometimes I'm very surprised when a student gives me a first draft of an article, of a manuscript, and it doesn't look like a manuscript at all. And I look at them, I was like, well, they said, this is my first time. I'm like, yes, but you've read hundreds of them up to this point. So are you just, and I find out then a lot of times students are just grabbing things from abstracts, they're not actually reading whole articles and getting the feel for what a whole article is. How do you set the stage for your work? How do you zone into why this worked? How did you describe your method so that somebody can understand them? How did you present your results? And how did you come up with, implications or outcomes? So that's assigned to me. And then secondly, I know depending if your first language is not English, you can have a lot of challenges with that. So then you have to try to get, I've heard some people really like the help they get from Al at Purdue, and other people don't think it's helpful at all. So I guess Kankui might have some additional insight on that. And then the other thing is, ask yourself, you have to, the first time, because had to go through this, because I was really bad at writing a 50-page manuscript, and it's really double-spaced. It probably should only be 25 pages. So I go and read each sentence. Did I say that clearly? Do I always have to say, e.g., for example? Did I say that again later? So, it takes a lot of work to see if you can streamline your story and tell the story, very directly. So, and then that bouncing back and forth we talked about, that helps.
I would say think of the hourglass. So if you think about your research and try to put it into a bigger context, that's kind of the layout of a paper, right? You have this high level motivation, and then you kind of funnel down into the details and the results. And then in the end, you're presenting the discussion where you're kind of bringing it back out. So try to kind of map your work into that sort of framework. And I think that should be very helpful. And I think when you're starting to write, don't sweat the small stuff right now. Think of the big picture, the layout. Just getting some text down into that overall structure is very helpful. And then you can always sort of wordsmith or tweak at the end and refine.
So normally this is what I do for my students. So like I normally have this discussion with my students about the outline, the big picture of that paper. Then like ask my student to start writing from the material method part. That's the easier part. So they can get to this writing mode, right? And so next one would be like normally is introduction. But I don't just tell my student, okay, you go and write your introduction. No, I ask them to write a few big points about what they want to include in the discussion, in the introduction part. So if like we both agree, these are some of the major points for the introduction, then the student can expand from those major points, right, into the entire introduction part. And the same thing for discussion. We have to make sure students know, okay, these are five of the points I really want to make discussion about. So they need to know that before they write their papers.
Okay.
Yeah, I have a slightly different order, but so here's another alternative. So yes, material and methods definitely go first so you can get into the mode of writing. And then for me, I usually try to have students write the results after that. And then, sometimes there's many, many results and you don't really know what to present. So then we can discuss about what are the most salient results we want to present in this paper. And then the introduction kind of sets up the background that the audience would need to know in order to understand the results. And then the discussion kind of comes last.
Okay. Thank you. So switching gears pretty much completely here. The next question that I have is probably going to be mostly directed towards Tony. But it is so if you're somebody who publishes both in peer-reviewed journals, but also does a lot of extension publications or publishes a lot of white papers, how do you balance between these two? So how do you decide, whether you're going to just do a extension publication with it, or if you're going to actually send it into a journal, or do you do both, just a shorter version for extension?
There is always a balancing act when it comes to this question. And for some extension dominant faculty, it is putting the primary emphasis on communication with their audience, crop consultants, farmers, you name it. And some will put their regular updates, especially now on social media, on a daily basis, complete with videos, etc., to illustrate key points in terms of symptomology of crop stress, for instance, or a soil health issue. So it's a balancing act, and in part it needs to be considered in the context of what is the total package that needs to be communicated so that your peers have access to the key points or key results of the research in a way that they can also use those results for their own multiplier extension efforts, whether it's in soil and water conservation districts or whether it's in natural resources and service and so on. So I find it a very difficult decision sometimes. And it is true that in my own program, as I've trained more graduate students, I've tended now to put more emphasis on peer review literature. in part because of supporting that effort, but also in part because of the fact that too often extension dominant positions have left too little of their excellent field research results in a table or in an electronic file, and it has not been accessible to people in other jurisdictions, other states, other countries. And so I find this a difficult subject to address well, because ideally you would do both. One of the other things I think that speaks a little bit to this is to make sure that in novel papers you involve ag communications people from your university in order to tell the story. Sometimes even extension personnel are not that good in sort of writing in a way that relates to a lay audience. And so what I found has worked well sometimes is to combine the results of a reasonable quality peer-reviewed manuscript together with a ag communication staff directed story, which tells the implications of this to a lay audience, which is then multiplied in newspapers and in farm magazines, et cetera, all around the country. And so the good news is, at least at academic institutions, is that there is an opportunity for a multiplier effect which relates and addresses some of the novel things about your science in a way that is interesting. And the good news is that a researcher who is trying to publish doesn't need to be all things to all people, but they sometimes need to put an extra push on telling the science to key people that are able to expand their story for the audiences that would benefit the most from it.
Okay. All right. So I know we're closing in on our time here. So I guess my final question for all of you will be, once you've published a paper, what if any kind of promotion do you do of the paper? Now I know, so previously in this series that we've done, we had Dr. Nielsen and Dr. Linda Prokopi, both from Purdue, talk about how they use Twitter to promote their work and get it out to an audience who may not otherwise see it. But I guess, do any of you use social media like that? And if not, is there anything else that you do to promote your work?
I don't do anything. I'm terrible, but I let my students do what they want. But one thing you had asked us related to that is, you had asked us in some preliminary questions, what are our metrics for measuring the impact of our research? And for me, it's, something that Dr. Vine mentioned, are we addressing a societal need, whatever that need is in whatever discipline? And then are you becoming the go-to person, or is your research group the go-to place to go to get students for different things? That tells me that the research we're doing and our integrity of our research is high. And then, of course, the citation thing. But in terms of promoting, I'm just bad because I don't emails enough electronics for me, but I'm trying to get better. I'm not a Facebooker either.
Ditto.
Okay.
Students are much better at that than I am, so they can have at it.
Okay.
I think it's important to have a strong homepage and to engage your whole lab in making sure it's updated, that it reflects the accomplishments of students, and that it also reflects both their published papers as well as perhaps key highlights from ongoing research. And I'm not the best at that,
Me
but
neither.
I'm thankful that I work with students who are more savvy than I am in that field.
Mm-hmm.
There's also some institutional support for, I'm not as familiar with the ones at Purdue, but I'm sure there is here for when you publish a paper, you can probably reach out to a communications specialist and they can help you promote your new manuscript.
Okay. All right. Well, with that, I don't want to take any more of your guys' time. I appreciate you participating in this, and hopefully we've helped out at least a couple people, right? But no, I appreciate all of your time, and hopefully we'll be back on campus soon, so we'll be able to see everybody in person. But I know that events won't be in person for a while. So for anybody watching, this will be available on Twitter and on YouTube, indefinitely, and so and as well as all of our future events. So with that, I just want to thank you guys again, and I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you.